Redfern-Keily Provincial Park, British Columbia, Canada. November 26, 2024. Two oil workers driving down a remote service road see something that shouldn't exist. A man walking alone. Barely alive. His frostbitten hands clutching a makeshift walking stick, face so gaunt he was barely recognizable. What they discovered that Tuesday morning would shock an entire nation. This man had been missing for 50 days in one of the most brutal wildernesses on Earth. From October 7 to November 26, 50 days where temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. 50 days where his family searched desperately, never knowing if he was dead or alive. 50 days that should have killed him. I'm about to tell you a survival story that will challenge everything you think you understand about human endurance. About what happens when civilization disappears and you're left with nothing but your will to live. About a 20-year-old who faced death every single morning for almost 2 months, and somehow found the strength to keep going. Before we dive deeper, if you believe every impossible survival story deserves to be told, hit that subscribe button, because this one might just save your life someday. But here's what nobody's talking about. The mistakes that nearly killed him. The moment he realized he might never see his family again. And the disturbing questions about why a massive search operation with over 100 volunteers couldn't find him, but 2 workers spotted him in seconds. Sam Benestick left for what should have been a simple 10-day camping and fishing trip on October 7, 2024. His family expected him home by October 17. Instead, they got 50 days of hell, wondering if their son was lying frozen somewhere in the Canadian wilderness. This isn't just a survival story. This is about a family that refused to give up when everyone else did. About ordinary people who became heroes. And about the haunting questions that experts still can't answer today. Because while Sam Benestick came home alive, there are others in these same mountains who didn't. And until we understand what really happened during those 50 days, how he survived when others couldn't, it could happen again. If you've ever been lost, even for an hour, you know that crushing panic. Sam felt that terror for 50 straight days. Imagine multiplying your worst outdoor nightmare by 1200. Let me take you back to where it all began. October 7, 2024. A young man, a fishing rod, and a decision that would change everything. Sam Benestick wasn't supposed to be a victim. At 20 years old, this young man from Kamloops, British Columbia had spent his entire life in the wilderness. His grandmother would later tell reporters, Sam is a guy who knows the woods. He's been raised as a hiker. He's a passionate fisherman. This wasn't some city kid playing weekend warrior. This was someone who understood the outdoors, respected it, lived for it. October 7, 2024 started like any other adventure for Sam. He loaded his red Honda dirt bike with camping gear, fishing equipment, and enough supplies for what should have been a routine 10-day trip. His destination was Redfern-Keily Provincial Park, a massive 80,000-hectare wilderness in the northern Rocky Mountains, about 250 kilometers northwest of Fort St. John. But here's what makes this case so terrifying. Experience can become your worst enemy. Sam's confidence in his abilities, built over years of successful wilderness trips, may have been the very thing that put him in danger. He'd done this before. He knew these mountains. He trusted himself completely. The park itself reads like a warning label. British Columbia Parks describes it as having lush alpine meadows, forested valley bottoms, serrated peaks, glaciers, waterfalls and large valley lakes. Beautiful words that hide a deadly reality. The official website warns visitors in stark terms, be prepared for any weather conditions while visiting the park. You are in an isolated area and weather can change rapidly. Isolated doesn't begin to cover it. This park sits 50 miles from the nearest road. 50 miles where your cell phone becomes a useless piece of plastic. 50 miles where if something goes wrong, you're completely on your own. The park is home to both grizzly and black bears. Weather conditions can shift from pleasant to life-threatening in minutes. And once you're inside, the wilderness doesn't care about your experience level. Sam made his final social media post before heading into the park. A simple photo, a confident smile, the excitement of another adventure ahead. His family saw that photo and felt nothing but pride. Their son, doing what he loved most. None of them could have imagined it might be the last photo they'd see of him for 50 days. The weather forecast for early October showed typical fall conditions. Cool, but manageable for an experienced camper. What it didn't show was the brutal early winter that was about to slam into northern British Columbia. Temperatures that would drop to 20 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Snow that would accumulate to over 15 centimeters. Conditions that would turn a routine camping trip into a fight for survival. Sam's last confirmed sighting was at the Redfern Lake trailhead, where he parked his red Honda dirt bike. Park officials would later find the bike exactly where he left it, covered in snow, a lonely reminder of the young man who'd walked into the wilderness and simply vanished. His family expected him home on October 17th. They'd done this dance before. Sam would disappear into the wilderness for days or weeks, then return with stories of incredible fishing spots and breathtaking views. They trusted him. They believed in his abilities. They had no reason to worry. But October 17th came and went. No Sam. No phone call. No text message. For the first time in his life, Sam Benestick had missed a return date. His family tried to stay calm. Maybe he'd found an amazing fishing spot and decided to extend his trip. Maybe he was having too much fun to come home on schedule. Maybe everything was fine. How many times have you told someone, "I'll be fine," before taking a risk? Sam's family heard those exact words before he left. Share this story because it might make someone think twice about going into the wilderness alone. Your share could literally save a life. October 19, 2024. 2 days past his expected return, Sam's family made the call that would change everything. They contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to report their son missing. In that moment, a routine camping trip became a missing person case. A family's worst nightmare had begun. The RCMP took the report seriously. This wasn't some teenager who'd run away from home. This was an experienced outdoorsman who'd never missed a return date, never failed to check in, never given his family reason to worry. Something was very wrong. Within hours, Sam's parents were in their car, driving the 6-hour journey from Kamloops to Fort St. John. They checked into the Buffalo Inn in Pink Mountain, a small hotel that would become their home base for the next 24 days. 24 days of hell, waiting for news that might never come. Mike Reed, the general manager of the Buffalo Inn, would later describe watching Sam's parents during those weeks. Two people holding on to hope while facing every parent's worst fear. They'd wake up each morning wondering if this would be the day they got the call. The good call, or the one that would destroy them forever. The search operation that launched on October 19th was massive by any standard. Over 120 volunteers from across British Columbia dropped everything to look for Sam. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police deployed K9 units. Helicopters took to the skies. Ground teams spread across the wilderness. Everyone believed they'd find him quickly. After all, how hard could it be to spot one person in the wilderness? They had no idea they were about to learn just how vast and unforgiving the Canadian wilderness could be. They had no idea that Sam was already fighting for his life, making decisions that would determine whether he lived or died. And they had no idea that despite their best efforts, despite their dedication, despite their expertise, they were about to fail in the most heartbreaking way possible. Sam made one decision on day 3 that saved his life, and another that nearly killed him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand what his family went through. Because while Sam was fighting to survive in the wilderness, his family was fighting their own battle against despair, hope, and the terrible unknown. The search teams were confident. They had the manpower, the equipment, and the expertise. What they didn't have was any idea of what Sam was going through, or how the wilderness was about to test every assumption they had about finding missing people. The clock was ticking, winter was coming, and somewhere in that vast wilderness, a young man was about to discover what it really means to be alone. The first week of searching felt like controlled chaos. Search and Rescue Coordinator Adam Hawkins from Prince George described the conditions his teams faced as incredibly challenging winter conditions. By the time the search began, over 15 centimeters of snow had already fallen across the park. Temperatures were dropping to -20 degrees Celsius. The wilderness that Sam had entered as a code playground was rapidly becoming a frozen tomb. Sandra Crocker, Sam's mother, began documenting their ordeal on Facebook. Her early posts radiated determination mixed with growing fear. "Tomorrow is a big day for our family with helicopters and a larger crew," she wrote on October 23. "Winter is setting in and we need to bring Sam home." Each word carried the weight of a mother's love and a mother's terror. The Buffalo Inn became the unofficial headquarters for the search operation. Mike Reed watched Sam's parents transform from worried family members into people consumed by a single purpose: finding their son. They barely ate. They barely slept. Every helicopter that returned without news felt like another nail in the coffin of their hope. The search area was described by volunteers as massive. "We're talking about 80,000 hectares of wilderness. To put that in perspective, that's larger than New York City. Imagine trying to find one person in an area bigger than all 5 boroughs combined, covered in snow, with terrain that ranges from gentle hills to steep mountain faces. Now imagine doing it when that person might be injured, might be unconscious, might be dead." The volunteers came from everywhere. Central Okanagan Search and Rescue. Kamloops Search and Rescue. Teams from 4 different regions dropped their lives to look for a young man they'd never met. These weren't paid professionals. These were ordinary people who understood that when someone goes missing, you don't ask questions. You just search. But the wilderness wasn't cooperating. Helicopter pilots reported visibility issues due to weather. Ground teams struggled through deep snow and treacherous terrain. The K9 units, usually so reliable at picking up human scent, found nothing. It was as if Sam Benestick had simply evaporated. By the second week, the tone of Sandra's Facebook posts began to change. The confident determination was still there, but you could read the fear between the lines. "We are scouring various peaks and rivers, looking for any clues about where Sam may have gone," she wrote. The word "scouring" tells you everything. This wasn't a systematic search anymore. This was desperation. The search teams were professional, thorough, and experienced. They followed protocols developed over decades of wilderness rescue operations. They searched the most likely areas first. They expanded their search radius systematically. They used every tool available to modern search and rescue operations. And they found absolutely nothing. Here's what makes this case so haunting. The search teams were looking in the right area. Sam would eventually be found close to where the initial search had begun. So why couldn't over 100 volunteers, trained search dogs, and helicopter crews find him? That question would haunt everyone involved and raise disturbing questions about the effectiveness of wilderness search operations. October 28, 2024. After 3 weeks of intensive searching, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police made the decision that no family ever wants to hear. The official search was being called off. Corporal Madonna Saunderson would later explain that the decision was based on the deteriorating weather conditions and the diminishing likelihood of finding Sam alive. For Sam's family, this wasn't just devastating news. It was a death sentence. In their minds, calling off the search meant giving up on their son. It meant accepting that he was dead. It meant going home without answers, without closure, without Sam. But Sandra and her family refused to accept defeat. The official search had ended, but the file remained open, the RCMP stated. What they didn't say was that an open file without active searching is just paperwork. The real search would now fall to a family with broken hearts and dwindling resources. Mike Reed at the Buffalo Inn watched this family make an impossible decision. They could go home, grieve, and try to move on with their lives. Or they could stay and continue searching on their own, spending money they didn't have, chasing hope that was growing thinner by the day. They chose to stay. Sandra Crocker spent 24 days in that hotel room, not knowing if her son was alive or dead. Every parent watching this knows that pain. Like this video if you believe no family should suffer alone. Because what happened next would test this family's faith in ways no family should ever be tested. The family began their own investigation. They scoured Sam's online search history, looking for clues about where he might have planned to go. They studied maps of the area, identifying every possible location he might have visited. They drove to remote locations, calling his name into the wilderness, hoping against hope for an answer that never came. Meanwhile, the weather was getting worse. November brought heavier snow, colder temperatures, and shorter days. If Sam was still alive out there, and that was becoming a bigger if every day, he was facing conditions that would challenge even the most experienced survival expert. The community of Pink Mountain rallied around Sam's family in ways that restored faith in human kindness. Local residents joined private search efforts. Businesses donated supplies. Strangers became friends united by a common purpose, bringing Sam home. But as the days turned into weeks, even the most optimistic supporters began to face reality. 3 weeks in -20-degree weather with limited supplies wasn't survivable. The human body simply couldn't endure those conditions for that long. The math was brutal and unforgiving. Sandra's Facebook posts during this period are heartbreaking to read. You can see her fighting to maintain hope while facing the growing likelihood that her son was dead. He didn't go unprepared, she insisted in one interview. He had warm gloves, a toque, rain gear, a hatchet, and a lot of peanut butter. She was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else that Sam had what he needed to survive. November 1st marked 25 days since Sam had gone missing. In an interview with CBC News, Sandra still maintained hope, but you could hear the exhaustion in her voice. 25 days of not knowing. 25 days of waking up wondering if this would be the day they found his body. 25 days of a hell that no parent should ever experience. The search teams had done everything right. They'd followed protocols, used proper equipment, deployed experienced personnel. But the wilderness had swallowed Sam Benestick without leaving a trace. The question that haunted everyone was simple: if they couldn't find him with all their resources and expertise, how could a family with no training and limited resources possibly succeed? What nobody knew was that while they were searching, Sam was fighting the battle of his life just miles away from where they were looking. He was making decisions that would determine whether he lived or died. He was facing challenges that would break most people. And he was discovering reserves of strength he never knew he had. The search teams were looking for a missing person. What they should have been looking for was a survivor. Because Sam Benestick wasn't just lost in the wilderness. He was at war with it. And that war was about to enter its most brutal phase. Just as Sam's family was beginning to accept the unthinkable, the wilderness claimed another victim. October 18, 2024. One day after Sam's expected return date, another man left for what should have been a routine trip into the same deadly wilderness. Jim Barnes, an experienced hunter, kissed his family goodbye and headed out for a grouse hunting expedition with his loyal dog Murphy. He was supposed to be back that evening. He never came home. The discovery of Jim's abandoned truck sent shockwaves through the search community. His vehicle was found with the keys still inside. His wallet, backpack, and rifle were all there, untouched. It was as if Jim and Murphy had simply stepped out of the truck and vanished into thin air. The only clues were frozen boot prints and dog paw prints leading away from the vehicle toward a riverbank, then nothing. For Sam's family, Jim's disappearance was both heartbreaking and terrifying. Heartbreaking because another family was now living their nightmare. Terrifying because it confirmed their worst fears about this wilderness. This wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. Something about this area was claiming people, and it was happening with disturbing frequency. The search for Jim Barnes lasted exactly 1 week. On October 25th, just 3 days before Sam's official search was called off, authorities suspended the search for Jim and Murphy. 2 families. 2 missing men. 2 searches that found nothing but questions and heartbreak. The community was reeling. How do 2 experienced outdoorsmen vanish in the same wilderness within days of each other? How do massive search operations with trained professionals, search dogs, and helicopter support find absolutely nothing? The questions were disturbing, and the answers were nowhere to be found. Sandra Crocker found herself in the impossible position of grieving for another family while fighting for her own son. She reached out to Jim's family, sharing the pain that only another family of a missing person could understand. 2 mothers, united by the worst kind of bond imaginable. The parallel cases created a pattern that search and rescue teams couldn't ignore. This wilderness wasn't just dangerous. It was actively hostile to human life. The terrain, the weather, the isolation, all combined to create conditions where people could disappear completely, leaving behind families destroyed by unanswered questions. Mike Reed at the Buffalo Inn watched Sam's parents process this new tragedy. He saw the fear in their eyes as they realized that if Jim Barnes, an experienced hunter familiar with the area, could vanish without a trace, what chance did Sam have? The hope they'd been clinging to became even more fragile. The search volunteers who'd worked both cases were devastated. These were people who dedicated their lives to bringing missing persons home safely. They'd succeeded countless times before. But this wilderness was different. It was swallowing people whole and leaving no evidence behind. Local residents began to whisper about the area being cursed. 2 men, both experienced outdoorsmen, both familiar with wilderness survival, both vanished within days of each other. The coincidence was too disturbing to ignore. Families started reconsidering their own wilderness plans. The fear was becoming contagious. For Sam's family, Jim's case represented their worst-case scenario playing out in real time. They watched another family go through the same stages of hope, desperation, and eventual acceptance that they were experiencing. It was like looking into a mirror that showed their own future. The frozen boot prints found near Jim's truck became a haunting image. Someone had walked away from safety into the wilderness and simply disappeared. Those prints, preserved in the snow, were the last evidence that Jim Barnes had ever existed. They led nowhere and explained nothing. Murphy's paw prints beside his master's boot prints made the story even more heartbreaking. A loyal dog following his human into danger, both of them disappearing together. Search teams knew that dogs often stay with their owners even in the worst conditions. If they couldn't find Murphy, it meant they couldn't find Jim either. The timing of Jim's disappearance created additional pressure on Sam's search. Resources were already stretched thin looking for Sam. Now they had to divide their attention between 2 missing persons in the same general area. Every helicopter hour spent looking for Jim was an hour not spent looking for Sam, and vice versa. The psychological impact on the search volunteers was severe. These were people who joined search and rescue to save lives, to bring families back together, to be heroes in the worst moments of people's lives. Instead, they were failing repeatedly, watching families destroyed while they found nothing but empty wilderness. Jim Barnes is still missing. His family still waits. While we celebrate Sam's survival, remember that not every story has a happy ending. Share this to keep Jim's case alive, because somewhere out there, a family is still hoping for a miracle that may never come. The media began covering both cases as a single story. 2 men vanish in Canadian wilderness. The headlines made it sound like an epidemic. Local tourism officials worried about the impact on the region's reputation. But for the families involved, this wasn't about tourism or media coverage. This was about 2 men who'd walked into the wilderness and disappeared. Search and rescue protocols came under scrutiny. How could 2 separate operations, using the same techniques and equipment, both fail so completely? Were the search methods inadequate for this type of terrain? Were the teams missing something obvious? The questions were uncomfortable, but they had to be asked. The weather during Jim's disappearance was similar to what Sam was experiencing. Freezing temperatures, accumulating snow, and deteriorating conditions that made survival increasingly unlikely with each passing day. If Sam was still alive, he was facing the same brutal conditions that had claimed Jim. As November progressed, the reality became undeniable. 2 men had entered this wilderness and only one would come home. The question wasn't whether both would survive. The question was whether either would survive. And for Sam's family, watching Jim's case unfold was like watching a preview of their own tragedy. The wilderness had shown its true nature. It wasn't just indifferent to human life. It was actively hostile. It took experienced outdoorsmen and erased them completely. It left families with questions that would never be answered and grief that would never fully heal. But while Jim Barnes remained lost forever, Sam Benestick was still fighting. Still surviving. Still refusing to become another statistic in this wilderness's deadly toll. He didn't know about Jim's disappearance. He didn't know about the parallel search. He only knew that he had to keep going, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one breath at a time. The wilderness had claimed Jim Barnes and Murphy. But it hadn't claimed Sam Benestick. Not yet. And in the frozen hell where he was fighting for his life, Sam was about to discover just how far the human spirit could be pushed before it finally broke. While search teams combed the wilderness above ground, Sam Benestick was living a nightmare that would test every limit of human endurance. His own account of those 50 days, given to police after his rescue, reveals a story of survival that defies everything we think we know about what the human body and mind can endure. The first critical decision came on day 3. Sam had spent 2 days in his car, probably hoping the weather would improve, probably thinking this was just a temporary setback. But as temperatures continued to drop and snow continued to fall, he faced a choice that would determine whether he lived or died. Stay with the car and hope for rescue, or leave the safety of shelter and try to find a better location. Sam chose to walk. He left his car, his last connection to civilization, and headed toward a mountainside creek. This decision probably saved his life, but it also guaranteed that search teams would never find him. His car remained at the trailhead, covered in snow, giving searchers no indication that he'd moved deeper into the wilderness. The creek location provided what Sam needed most: water. In survival situations, you can live weeks without food, but only days without water. The creek gave him a reliable source of hydration, but it also exposed him to the elements in ways that would slowly destroy his body. For 10 to 15 days, Sam camped beside that creek. Imagine waking up every morning to temperatures 20 degrees below zero. Imagine trying to start a fire with numb fingers and wet wood. Imagine the constant battle between conserving energy and staying warm enough to survive another night. His body began the slow process of shutting down non-essential functions. Fat reserves disappeared first, then muscle mass. His immune system weakened. His cognitive abilities started to decline as his brain fought to maintain basic functions with inadequate nutrition and constant stress. But Sam's real test was still coming. After 2 weeks at the creek, he made another life-or-death decision. He moved down the valley to a dried creek bed, where he built what he hoped would be a more permanent shelter. This location would become both his salvation and nearly his grave. The shelter Sam built in that creek bed represented everything he'd learned about survival. He used available materials to create protection from wind and snow. He positioned it to take advantage of natural windbreaks. He tried to balance concealment with accessibility. For a 20-year-old with no formal survival training, it was remarkably sophisticated. But then disaster struck. The shelter caught fire. In an instant, Sam lost his primary protection against the elements. Worse, he suffered smoke inhalation that damaged his lungs and made breathing even more difficult in the thin, cold air. The fire that was supposed to keep him warm nearly killed him. This was Sam's breaking point. Alone, injured, without adequate shelter, facing another month of brutal winter conditions. Most people would have given up. Most people would have laid down in the snow and waited for death. Sam made a different choice. He cut up his sleeping bag. Think about that decision for a moment. His sleeping bag was his only source of warmth during the night, when temperatures dropped to their most deadly levels. Cutting it up meant sacrificing his ability to stay warm while sleeping. But it also gave him material to wrap around his legs during the day, protecting his extremities from frostbite while he moved around looking for food and maintaining his shelter. This decision reveals everything about Sam's character. He was willing to sacrifice long-term comfort for short-term mobility. He understood that staying active was more important than staying warm. He chose to fight rather than simply endure. The walking sticks he created became his lifeline. As his body weakened and his balance deteriorated, those sticks kept him upright. They allowed him to move around his camp, to gather firewood, to maintain the basic activities that kept him alive. Without them, he would have been trapped in one location, unable to care for himself. The frostbite began slowly, then accelerated. His fingers and toes, the extremities most vulnerable to cold, started the process of tissue death that would leave permanent damage. The pain was excruciating at first, then disappeared as nerve endings died. Sam was literally watching parts of his body die while the rest of him fought to stay alive. Food became an obsession and a fantasy. His body was consuming itself, breaking down muscle tissue to fuel basic functions. He probably hallucinated about meals, dreamed about his mother's cooking, fantasized about the simplest foods. The peanut butter his mother mentioned he'd packed was probably gone within the first week. The psychological battle was as brutal as the physical one. Complete isolation does things to the human mind that are difficult to understand unless you've experienced them. Sam talked to himself, probably argued with himself, maybe even hallucinated conversations with family members. The line between reality and fantasy becomes blurred when you're alone for that long. Sleep became both necessary and dangerous. His body needed rest to heal and conserve energy, but sleeping in those conditions meant risking hypothermia. Every night was a gamble. Close your eyes and maybe never wake up, or stay awake and slowly go insane from exhaustion. By day 30, Sam's body was shutting down. His immune system was compromised. His cognitive abilities were severely impaired. His physical strength was nearly gone. Medical experts would later say that most people don't survive beyond 3 weeks in those conditions. Sam had been out there more than a month and was still fighting. The smoke inhalation from his shelter fire created ongoing respiratory problems. Every breath was a struggle in the thin, cold air. His lungs, damaged by smoke and stressed by constant cold, couldn't process oxygen efficiently. He was slowly suffocating while simultaneously freezing to death. But something kept him going. Maybe it was thoughts of his family. Maybe it was pure stubbornness. Maybe it was the kind of survival instinct that only emerges when death is the only alternative. Whatever it was, it kept Sam Benestick alive when everything else said he should be dead. On day 40, Sam made the decision that would ultimately save his life. He left his creek bed shelter and started moving toward what he hoped might be a road. This decision required him to abandon the only home he'd known for weeks, to leave behind the shelter he'd built with his own hands, to venture into unknown territory when he was at his weakest. The walk that would lead to his rescue nearly killed him. Using his walking sticks to stay upright, wrapped in pieces of his cut-up sleeping bag, Sam Benestick began what he probably thought would be his final journey. He was walking toward either salvation or death, and he had no way of knowing which one he'd find. Sam cut up his only sleeping bag to survive. He sacrificed his warmth for mobility. When did you last sacrifice something important for someone else? Comment below and let's honor that kind of courage, because Sam's story proves that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that save your life. What Sam didn't know was that his 50-day ordeal was about to end in the most unexpected way possible. Two ordinary men, doing their ordinary job, were about to become the heroes in a story that would shock the world. But first, Sam had to survive one more night, take one more step, make one more choice to keep fighting when everything in his body was telling him to give up. The wilderness had tested Sam Benestick in every way possible. It had frozen his body, starved his flesh, and tortured his mind. But it hadn't broken his spirit. And that unbroken spirit was about to encounter something it hadn't seen in 50 days, hope. November 26, 2024. 11:30 in the morning. Two oil and gas workers were driving down a remote service road, heading to their job site for what they thought would be another routine day of surveying well locations. They'd been working this same road for a week, driving back and forth, marking sites, doing the unglamorous work that keeps the energy industry running. Then they saw something that shouldn't exist. A figure walking on the road. Alone. In the middle of nowhere. Using two sticks to support himself, moving slowly, deliberately, like every step was a monumental effort. The workers slowed their truck, trying to process what they were seeing. "The hell is that person doing walking on this road?" one of them said. As they got closer, the impossible became real. This wasn't some lost day hiker. This was someone who looked like he'd been through hell. Skeletal thin, wrapped in what appeared to be pieces of fabric, barely able to stand upright. And then recognition hit them like a lightning bolt. This was Sam Benestick. The missing hiker they'd heard about on the news. The young man who'd vanished 50 days ago. The person everyone assumed was dead. The workers pulled over immediately. When they approached Sam and took the walking sticks from his hands to help him, he nearly collapsed. His legs, wrapped in pieces of his cut-up sleeping bag, could barely support his weight. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his body showing the unmistakable signs of prolonged starvation and exposure. But he was alive. Against every odd, against every medical prediction, against every assumption about human survival limits, Sam Benestick was alive. The workers helped him into their truck, cranked up the heat, and immediately started feeding him their sandwiches. Sam ate slowly, carefully, his body no longer accustomed to processing food. They could see the frostbite damage on his hands and face, the way he struggled to breathe, the trembling that wouldn't stop. These two ordinary men had just witnessed a miracle, and they knew it. The truck didn't have cell phone coverage at that location, so they drove toward civilization, toward the nearest point where they could get a signal. Sam sat in the passenger seat, probably still not believing that his 50-day nightmare was finally over. When they reached cell coverage, Sam made the phone call that would end his family's 50 days of hell. His father answered, probably expecting another update from a search volunteer or maybe a business call. Instead, he heard his son's voice. Weak, hoarse, but unmistakably alive. "Dad, it's me. I'm okay." For words that brought a family back from the edge of despair. Mike Reed, the general manager of the Buffalo Inn where Sam's parents had been staying, got the news in a text message that simply said, "They found him." Reed had watched this family suffer for 24 days. He'd seen them wake up every morning hoping for good news and go to bed every night with their hearts breaking a little more. When Reed called Sam's father to confirm the news, the emotion in the man's voice was overwhelming. "They found him," he said, and Reed could hear 24 days of fear and hope and love all pouring out in those 3 words. Sam was rushed to the hospital in Fort Nelson, where medical staff began the delicate process of treating someone who'd survived the impossible. Severe frostbite on his hands and feet. Smoke inhalation damage to his lungs. Extreme dehydration and malnutrition. Weight loss that would have been fatal if it had continued much longer. But he was alive. His vital signs were stable. His mind was clear. He was going to recover. Sandra Crocker made the 6-hour drive from Kamloops to Fort Nelson, probably breaking every speed limit along the way. When she walked into that hospital room and saw her son giving a thumbs up from his hospital bed, 50 days of nightmare finally ended. Sam's first complaint, according to his mother, was that he hasn't caught one fish. Even after 50 days of hell, even after nearly dying multiple times, Sam's sense of humor was intact. He was still the same young man who'd left for a fishing trip 7 weeks earlier. The photo Sandra shared of Sam in his hospital bed, giving a thumbs up with a weak but genuine smile, became a symbol of hope for everyone who'd followed his story. Here was proof that miracles still happen. Here was evidence that the human spirit can endure things that seem impossible. The 2 oil workers who found Sam became instant heroes, though they insisted they'd just done what anyone would do. They'd stopped to help a stranger, and in doing so, they'd saved a life and reunited a family. Their ordinary day had become extraordinary through a simple act of human kindness. Corporal Madonna Saunderson of the RCMP summed up what everyone was feeling: finding Sam alive is the absolute best outcome. After all the time he was missing, it was feared that this would not be the outcome. The Central Okanagan Search and Rescue Team, which had been involved in the search, called Sam's survival nothing short of miraculous. These were people who'd seen every kind of wilderness emergency, who understood better than anyone what Sam had endured. For them to call it miraculous meant something. The rescue raised as many questions as it answered. How had Sam survived when medical experts said it was impossible? Why couldn't the massive search operation find him when 2 workers spotted him immediately? Where exactly had he been for 50 days, and how had he managed to stay alive? Sam told police he'd moved from his initial creek location down into the valley, where he'd built a shelter in a dried creek bed. He'd stayed there until the morning he was found, when he'd made the decision to try to reach a road. That decision, made when he was at his weakest point, had saved his life. The timing was perfect in the way that only miracles can be. If Sam had tried to reach the road a day earlier or a day later, those workers wouldn't have been there. If he'd chosen a different direction, he might have walked deeper into the wilderness instead of toward help. If his strength had failed him just a few hundred yards sooner, he would have collapsed where no one would ever find him. 2 workers stopped their day to save a life. They didn't have to help, but they did. When did you last stop to help a stranger? Share this story because kindness is contagious, and somewhere out there, someone else might need a miracle too. The rescue was the end of Sam's ordeal, but it was also the beginning of new questions. How do you process 50 days of trauma? How do you return to normal life after experiencing something that few humans have ever survived? How do you explain to people what it's like to face death every day for almost 2 months? For Sam's family, the rescue was pure joy mixed with overwhelming relief. They'd gotten their son back from the dead. They'd been given a second chance at being a complete family. The 24 days they'd spent at the Buffalo Inn, the sleepless nights, the desperate searches, the growing despair, all of it was finally over. But even as they celebrated Sam's survival, they couldn't forget Jim Barnes and his dog Murphy, still missing somewhere in that same wilderness. Sam had come home, but another family was still living the nightmare. The wilderness had released one victim but kept another. The rescue made international news. A feel-good story in a world that desperately needed one. Proof that sometimes, against all odds, the good guys win. Evidence that the human spirit really is unbreakable when it has something worth fighting for. Sam Benestick had walked into the wilderness as a young man looking for adventure. He'd walked out as a survivor who'd redefined what human endurance could accomplish. His 50-day ordeal was over, but his story was just beginning. The first thing Sam said to his rescuers will break your heart and show you who he really is. But that's a story for the questions that still haunt this case, because while Sam came home alive, there are disturbing truths about his rescue that nobody wants to talk about. Sam Benestick's rescue should have been the perfect ending to an impossible story. But the more investigators looked into the details, the more disturbing questions emerged. Questions that challenge everything we think we know about wilderness search operations. Questions that suggest systemic failures that could cost lives in future cases. The most haunting question is the simplest one: how did over 120 trained volunteers, search dogs, and helicopter crews fail to find Sam when 2 oil workers spotted him immediately? The search operation had been massive by any standard. Ground teams had covered thousands of acres. Helicopters had flown grid patterns over the entire area. Search dogs had been deployed to track any human scent. The operation had followed established protocols developed over decades of successful rescues. Yet Sam had been there the entire time, surviving in a location that should have been within the search perimeter. Adam Hawkins, the search coordinator from Prince George, described the conditions as incredibly challenging winter conditions. But challenging conditions are exactly when search and rescue teams are supposed to prove their worth. These weren't amateur volunteers stumbling around in the woods. These were trained professionals with specialized equipment and years of experience. The technology failures were equally disturbing. Modern search and rescue operations rely heavily on thermal imaging equipment that can detect body heat from aircraft. Sam had been maintaining fires for warmth throughout his ordeal. Those fires should have been visible to thermal imaging cameras, especially during the early weeks when helicopter searches were most intensive. Weather conditions were cited as a major factor in the search difficulties, but weather affects everyone equally. If conditions were too dangerous for search helicopters, how did Sam survive them on the ground with minimal equipment? The contradiction suggests that either the weather wasn't as prohibitive as claimed, or search operations were called off too quickly. The timeline raises additional questions. Sam was found walking on a service road that connected to the main highway system. This wasn't some remote game trail deep in the wilderness. This was a road that oil and gas workers used regularly. Why wasn't this road included in the initial search pattern? The RCMP has been notably quiet about the specific details of where Sam was found relative to where the search teams have been looking. Corporal Madonna Saunderson confirmed that Sam was located in the area where he was believed to be, but refused to provide more specific information about search patterns or why that area hadn't been thoroughly covered. Sam's own account of his survival raises questions that investigators are still trying to answer. He told police he'd moved from his initial creek location to a dried creek bed where he'd built a more permanent shelter. But when exactly did he make this move? Was it before or after the official search was called off? The shelter fire that nearly killed Sam should have been visible to search aircraft. Smoke from a fire in wilderness conditions can be seen for miles, especially from the air. Search protocols specifically include looking for signs of human activity like smoke or fire. Yet no search team reported seeing any evidence of Sam's presence. The walking sticks that Sam used to support himself during his final walk to rescue were made from materials he'd found in the wilderness. But the construction of those sticks showed a level of craftsmanship that suggests Sam had been mobile and mentally sharp enough to create sophisticated survival tools. This contradicts the assumption that he would have been incapacitated by his ordeal. Medical experts who examined Sam after his rescue were amazed not just by his survival, but by his relatively good condition considering his ordeal. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an emergency physician familiar with hypothermia cases, noted that Sam's cognitive function was remarkably intact for someone who'd endured 50 days of extreme conditions. This raises the question: if Sam was in good enough condition to walk several miles to reach the road where he was found, why couldn't he have signaled for help during the 3 weeks when search operations were active? The cut-up sleeping bag that Sam used to wrap his legs was found to be a high-quality piece of equipment that would have provided significant insulation even when modified. This suggests that Sam had made intelligent survival decisions throughout his ordeal, not the desperate choices of someone slowly dying from exposure. The timing of Sam's rescue is almost too perfect to believe. He decided to leave his shelter and walk toward a road on the exact day that 2 oil workers happened to be driving that specific route. The odds of this coincidence are astronomical, leading some to question whether Sam had been monitoring the road for some time before making his move. 120 volunteers searched for weeks and couldn't find Sam. But 2 workers found him in minutes. Something's wrong with this system. Share this story and demand better search protocols, because the next missing person might not be as lucky as Sam. The resource allocation during the search has come under scrutiny. Significant manpower and equipment were deployed to look for Sam, but the search for Jim Barnes, who disappeared just days later, was called off after only 1 week. Both men were missing in the same general area under similar conditions, yet one search lasted 3 weeks while the other lasted 7 days. The psychological impact on the search volunteers has been largely ignored in media coverage of Sam's rescue. These are people who dedicate their lives to saving others, who train extensively for exactly these situations, who take personal responsibility for every person they're asked to find. The failure to locate Sam despite their best efforts has left many questioning their abilities and their methods. Search and rescue protocols are being quietly reviewed in the wake of Sam's case, but officials are reluctant to discuss what changes might be implemented. The implication is that current methods are inadequate for certain types of terrain or conditions, but admitting this publicly would undermine confidence in search operations. The cost of the search operation has never been publicly disclosed, but estimates suggest it exceeded several $100,000 in personnel, equipment, and aircraft time. This raises questions about resource allocation and whether the same results could have been achieved with different methods. Sam's case has exposed uncomfortable truths about the limitations of modern search and rescue operations. Despite all our technology, all our training, all our protocols, we can still fail to find someone who's right under our noses. The wilderness can still hide people so effectively that they become invisible to our best efforts. The most disturbing question of all is this: how many other missing persons could have been found if search operations had been conducted differently? How many families have been told their loved ones are dead when they might actually be alive, waiting for rescue that never comes? Sam Benestick survived 50 days in conditions that should have killed him. But he also survived a search and rescue failure that could have cost him his life. His rescue wasn't just a miracle of human endurance. It was a miracle that happened despite systemic failures that continue to put other missing persons at risk. There's something about Sam's story that doesn't add up, and the authorities know it. But they're not talking. And until they do, other families will face the same nightmare that Sam's family endured, wondering if their loved ones are really dead or just invisible to the people who are supposed to find them. the questions surrounding Sam's case aren't just academic curiosities. They're matters of life and death for future missing persons and their families. Because if we can't learn from Sam's case, if we can't fix the problems it exposed, then his 50 days of hell will have been meaningless. And that would be the real tragedy. Sam Benestick's story didn't end with his rescue. In many ways, it was just beginning. Because survival stories only matter if they prevent future tragedies. And right now, the system that failed to find Sam is still failing other families across North America. 3 months after his rescue, Sam has made a remarkable recovery. The frostbite damage to his hands and feet required ongoing medical treatment, but doctors say he'll regain full function. The smoke inhalation that damaged his lungs has healed. The weight he lost during his ordeal has been restored. Physically, Sam Benestick has returned to the young man who left for a fishing trip in October. But the psychological scars run deeper. Sam has been reluctant to discuss the mental aspects of his ordeal, but those close to him say he's dealing with survivor's guilt. Why did he come home when Jim Barnes didn't? Why did he survive when so many others in similar situations don't? These are questions that don't have easy answers. His family has been transformed by the experience. Sandra Crocker, who spent 24 days in hell not knowing if her son was alive or dead, has become an advocate for missing persons' families. She understands the unique torture of not knowing, of hoping against hope, of facing the possibility that someone you love has simply vanished forever. The Benestick family has used their platform to keep Jim Barnes' case in the public eye. They know that while their story had a happy ending, Jim's family is still living the nightmare. They refuse to let Jim be forgotten, refuse to let his disappearance become just another cold case file gathering dust. Mike Reed at the Buffalo Inn has seen the lasting impact on the community. Pink Mountain is a small place where everyone knows everyone. The 24 days when Sam's family made the hotel their base of operations brought the entire community together in ways that continue today. People who were strangers became family, united by a common purpose. The 2 oil workers who found Sam have been recognized as heroes, though they insist they just did what anyone would do. Their employer has used their story as an example of the company's values, but the workers themselves remain humble about their role. They were in the right place at the right time, and they made the right choice. But recognition isn't enough. The systemic problems that Sam's case exposed are still there, still putting other missing persons at risk. Search and rescue protocols that failed to find Sam are still being used. Technology that missed his fires and shelters is still being deployed. Training that proved inadequate is still being provided to volunteers. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police has quietly implemented some changes to their missing persons procedures, but they've been reluctant to discuss what those changes are or whether they address the specific failures in Sam's case. The official position is that the search was conducted properly given the conditions, but that position is increasingly difficult to defend. Search and rescue organizations across Canada are grappling with the implications of Sam's case. If their best efforts, using their best people and equipment, can fail so completely, what does that say about their effectiveness? How many other missing persons might be alive but unfindable using current methods? The technology gap is particularly troubling. Thermal imaging equipment that should have detected Sam's fires failed completely. GPS tracking systems that should have helped coordinate search efforts proved inadequate for the terrain. Communication systems that should have kept search teams connected broke down in critical moments. But the human element is even more concerning. Over 120 volunteers, many with years of experience, searched for 3 weeks and found nothing. These weren't incompetent people making obvious mistakes. These were dedicated professionals doing their best with the tools and training available to them. The question that haunts everyone involved is simple: what if Sam hadn't been strong enough to walk to that road? What if he'd died in his shelter just days before his rescue? Would anyone ever have found him? Would his family have spent the rest of their lives wondering what happened to their son? The answer is probably no. And that's unacceptable. Wilderness safety education has become a passion for Sam's family. They've realized that better preparation could have prevented Sam's ordeal entirely. Simple things like carrying a satellite communicator, filing a detailed trip plan, or traveling with a partner could have changed everything. But education isn't enough if the rescue system fails when it's needed most. Families need to know that if their loved ones go missing, the search will be thorough, professional, and effective. Right now, Sam's case proves that's not always true. The cost of search operations has become a factor in how long searches continue and how many resources are deployed. Sam's search cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and found nothing. Jim Barnes' search was called off after 1 week, presumably to control costs. These are impossible decisions, but they're being made based on budgets rather than the value of human life. Technology exists that could revolutionize wilderness search operations. Drone swarms that could cover vast areas quickly and efficiently. Satellite imaging that could detect human activity in real time. AI systems that could analyze search patterns and identify gaps in coverage. But implementing these technologies requires investment and political will that currently doesn't exist. The legal framework around search and rescue operations protects agencies from liability when searches fail. This removes the financial incentive to improve methods and equipment. Families like the Benesticks have no recourse when the system fails them, no way to demand better performance or accountability. Sam's case has exposed the uncomfortable truth that wilderness search and rescue is still largely based on hope and luck rather than science and technology. We send volunteers into dangerous conditions with inadequate equipment and outdated methods, then act surprised when they fail to find people who are right under their noses. The international attention Sam's story received has created an opportunity for change. Media coverage has highlighted the problems with current search methods. Public interest has created political pressure for reform. Sam's survival has given advocates a powerful example of what's at stake. But attention fades quickly, and political pressure dissipates unless it's sustained. The window for meaningful reform is narrow, and it's closing fast. If changes aren't made soon, Sam's story will become just another feel-good survival tale instead of the catalyst for systemic improvement it could be. Sam survived 50 days of hell so his story could save others. But stories only save lives if they're shared. If you believe no family should suffer like Sam's did, if you think Jim Barnes deserves justice, if you want to prevent future tragedies, then you know what to do. Subscribe, share, and help us fight for change. Because Sam's miracle only matters if it prevents someone else's tragedy. The fight for justice in Sam's case isn't about blame or punishment. It's about learning from failure and doing better next time. It's about honoring Sam's survival by making sure other families don't have to endure what his family went through. Sam Benestick walked out of the wilderness alive, but he shouldn't have had to walk out at all. He should have been found weeks earlier by the people who were paid and trained to find him. The fact that he wasn't represents a failure of systems, not individuals. That failure cost Sam 50 days of his life and nearly cost him everything. It cost his family 24 days of hell and trauma that will last forever. It cost taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars in search operations that accomplished nothing. Most importantly, it cost Jim Barnes his life. Because the same system that failed to find Sam also failed to find Jim. And Jim didn't have Sam's strength, Sam's luck, or Sam's miracle. The wilderness gave Sam Benestick a second chance at life. Now it's up to all of us to make sure that second chance means something. Because somewhere out there, another family is about to face the same nightmare. Another search team is about to deploy with the same inadequate methods. Another missing person is about to discover whether they have what it takes to survive when the system fails them. Sam's story proves that miracles can happen. But we can't count on miracles to save lives. We need better systems, better training, better technology, and better accountability. We need to learn from Sam's case and do better next time. Because there will be a next time. There always is. The only question is whether we'll be ready for it. What Sam plans to do with his second chance at life will surprise you. He's not retreating from the wilderness that nearly killed him. He's not avoiding the outdoors that caused his family so much pain. Instead, he's planning to use his experience to help others. To teach wilderness safety. To advocate for better search methods. To make sure his 50 days of hell serve a purpose. That's the kind of courage that kept him alive in the wilderness. And it's the kind of courage that could save other lives if we're smart enough to listen to what he learned during those 50 days when death was his constant companion. Sam Benestick survived the impossible. Now it's up to us to make sure his survival means something. Because the greatest tragedy wouldn't be that Sam nearly died in the wilderness. The greatest tragedy would be if we learned nothing from his story and let it happen to someone else. The fight for justice continues. And it starts with you.